Aiboan, Vanakkam, Assalamu alaikum, and a very, very warm welcome. On behalf of AmCham Sri Lanka and USAID, it is my absolute pleasure and privilege to welcome you all this beautiful morning to the launch of TRADESHIFTS, Opportunities for Sri Lanka from Global Supply Chain Shifts. TRADESHIFTS has been at the forefront of the AmCham Sri Lanka agenda for several months now, and I am personally excited and thrilled to finally be sharing it with you. To introduce you to TRADESHIFTS, AmCham Sri Lanka President, Prasanta Jayamahan.
Thank you, Roy. Your Excellencies, Honorable Ministers, Members of Parliament, Secretaries, Chairpersons, and representatives of various chambers of commerce, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, my dear friends. Good morning, warm greetings and welcome to everyone, both here in Sri Lanka and across the globe. We are excited for the next 2 hours ahead of us as you join us for the launch of TRADESHIFTS, Opportunities for Sri Lanka from Global Supply Chain Shifts, an initiative of AmCham Sri Lanka in collaboration with the USAID. As you may know, recent events have led to US companies to explore the options of diversifying their manufacturing and supply facilities away from a single source country. COVID-19 and the resultant shutdown had a showstopper effect on the global supply chain, as it became clear that a single country closing its borders had a significant effect on the value chain on the other side of the world. It became obvious that supply chains or manufacturing bases had limited risk mitigation plans. A good example is how Nissan Motors shut down their manufacturing plant in Japan on the 21st of February, very early into the COVID outbreak, because a few key components couldn't be shipped from its supplier in China. I quote the press release as follows: "It only takes one missing part to stop a production line." Hence, outside geopolitical tensions and trade barriers, the supply chain shifts that are currently being discussed are required so that global commerce and trade can continue irrespective of any regulatory shutdown or future issues. As such, US companies are relocating or creating secondary facilities in the Asian region with particular focus on India, Vietnam, Bangladesh, and Malaysia, who over the past few months have benefited immensely from these shifts. Industries that have moved or expected to shift are key sectors such as electrical, pharmaceutical, apparel, food and beverage, furniture, medical devices, electronics, mechanical, chemicals, boats and automobile components, amongst others. The value of the trade shifts are estimated at over $100 billion over the next 4 to 5 years. Estimated over $100 billion of trade within the next 4 to 5 years. This is real and available. My dear honorary guests, this presents an extraordinary opportunity for Sri Lankan companies. This is about timing and the ability to be positioned to capture a slice of that trade that will anyway diversify to our Asian region. You will be happy to understand that this is an activity that AmCham, as a chamber, has taken into serious consideration. We are proud to present you today an initiative of the private sector led by AmCham, funded by USAID. TRADESHIFTS, a 3-phase project aimed at analyzing and identifying the potential shifts in industry with respect to Sri Lanka. The methodology will be to study these identified shifts and available opportunities at a micro and internal level in order to establish and agree on the low-hanging fruits or products that are most suitable for Sri Lankan companies, and concurring on the necessary overall policy developments necessary to harness the same. Next, in collaboratively engaging with the government of Sri Lanka to provide leadership, necessary incentives, and implement the policy reforms necessary to attract these opportunities. And of course, as a chamber that is primarily promoting and development of bilateral trade and investment between Sri Lanka and the US, the final phase of this project will be in assisting in creating a country strategy to proactively engage with potential US businesses that are in the process of supply chain diversification. None of this is possible by any of us doing it alone. This is an opportunity for the private sector, the various chambers, industry groups, and the government of Sri Lanka to work collaboratively to achieve the outcome. Ladies and gentlemen, Sri Lanka only needs a few percentage of the estimated $100 billion in trade shifts to have a generational effect on the economic situation of the country. It will be a generational effect. With that, I'm pleased to share with you today the results of the first phase of this collaboration, a report launched by Deloitte Consulting under the auspices of the United States Agency for International Development, USAID. This report will be presented by Stewart Pierce-Gardner, consultant specialist for Deloitte, who will help identify the likely future shifts in supply chain strategies across the short and medium term, the drivers of such shifts, and highlight implications for Sri Lanka. It's an early stage document. We would have with you this printed copy of the document together with digital format, which I'm sure you had time to review as an initial personal review. We also welcome you to send any questions or clarifications for Stewart on the provided email, which will be responded by Deloitte Consulting or partner within the next few days. I take this opportunity to inform you that after the report presentation today, the various chambers and industry groups here on this call will continue to meet and discuss the industry or even product level matters pertaining to the supply chain shift opportunity. Following a process of discussion with both the EDB and the BOI of Sri Lanka, we have identified 5 sectoral-led study groups that have distinguished participation of major related industry associations and organizations who will, over the next 3 weeks, study the findings of this and other resources, brainstorm, and to provide substantial working paper that we can then take on to the next phase of this project. I'm confident that the presentation today will lay the foundation for an inclusive and early discussion on how Sri Lanka can leverage on the current supply chain shifts and the opportunity. As I conclude, I would like to summarize that this is a real opportunity for us all, the private sector, the various chambers, and the GOSL, to work collaboratively in securing this opportunity for Sri Lanka. As chambers, we can only facilitate and promote dialogue between countries and businesses. It is finally the private sector and the government who will need to drive and then benefit from this activity. As such, I humbly request the various government sector leaders on this call to give leadership and support to the journey before us all. I want to thank the USAID, especially Mr. Reed Ankerman, his team, and their implementer Deloitte partner for working with AmCham over the past 7 months in creating this activity and project. To all our stakeholders on this call, I believe by participating in this webinar and discussions and future discussions, we are in the right place at the right time. Let's make this work. I now take pleasure in calling Mr. Reed Ankerman, Mission Director of Sri Lanka for USAID, to share a few words. Thank you and blessings.
Thank you, Prasanta. Can you hear me?
We can.
Yes. I'm happy to be here today as part of the U.S. Embassy in Colombo. I represent the development arm of the U.S. government, USAID. And we're pleased to partner with AmCham to host this forum under the Partnership for Accelerating Results in Trade, National Expenditure and Revenue Project, which we call PARTNER for short. And PARTNER has provided the required technical assistance, as Prasanta mentioned, through Deloitte for this forum. And so thank you to everyone for this timely initiative. Global supply chains are changing. Some changes are already in motion, and they were accelerated, though, during the pandemic, while other changes are the result of companies looking to secure their supply chains through a geographic diversification to lessen market risk. It is clear that many countries are examining the shifts taking place to see how they can take advantage of the opportunities that these shifts present. In a competitive investment landscape, Sri Lanka, we believe, can benefit if it properly identifies and strategically pursues the most promising opportunities for Sri Lanka. To understand the ongoing and future shifts in supply chain strategies of international businesses and the likely drivers of change that would be useful to the public and private sector in Sri Lanka, USAID's Partner Project compiled a report titled Global Supply Chain Strategies, Current Trends, and Future Shifts. The report will help to provide a realistic and practical international business-oriented perspective on supply chain shifts in the region and implications for a country, in this case, Sri Lanka. We hope that today's forum is the start of an important conversation, a conversation anchored in business-relevant insights such as those provided in the supply chain report, and that they can be advanced by the private sector and business professionals like yourselves and acted upon in coordination with the public sector. At the center of USAID's development assistance is support for broad-based economic growth, which is essential to sustainable long-term development as Sri Lanka moves toward advanced economy status. Before I conclude, let me thank AmCham, especially Prasanta, Varai, and their team for proactively coming forward as a private sector voice and offering a platform for action. And I would also like to, of course, thank USAID's partner, aptly named partner, for implementing this through Deloitte and also proactively embarking on this important work by studying this area and developing a useful resource for conversation. So I wish you all a very productive day of deliberations, and I look forward to support the advancement as appropriate of a set of actions to move this agenda forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Reid. And now, of course, it's my pleasure to invite Chairman of the Export Development Board of Sri Lanka, Prabhash Subasinghe, to address you.
Good morning, everyone. Right, just a sound check. You can hear me well?
Yes, we can. Thank you, Prabhash.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I hope everyone is well. And I'm pleased to be here to speak a few words this morning, this very important event, talking about trade shifts. I'm also pleased to see a private sector-led event between the USAID and the AmCham studying the potential on trade shifts and how Sri Lanka as a country can capitalize on this. The government of Sri Lanka, and especially my organization, the Export Development Board, is pleased that there are organizations that would look into situations like trade shifts and also support our businesses to understand better and how we can monetize these shifts for the benefit of our country and for sure for the benefit of our exporters in Sri Lanka. Not only I believe that this is timely, I also think this is a game changer for our country. Trade as a percentage of global GDP is 60%, and 15% of all manufactured items are imported globally. Supply chain has become a CEO and a board level topic now. Good news is that trade has not done as badly as forecasted at the beginning of the pandemic, which was a 30% drop of global trade. However, now it is forecasted to be at 90% of pre-pandemic levels. For obvious reasons, with the escalation of COVID, the single country supply source has become a question now. And I think we've seen over the last so many months, US companies, and not only US companies, other companies in the rest of the world have been looking at diversifying their supply base and looking for alternate areas to go and diversify. Of course, there have been opportunities in Vietnam, in India, in Bangladesh, in Malaysia, in many countries in the Asian region. I believe the time has come for Sri Lanka to be on the spotlight and for Sri Lanka to be one of the contenders for these trade shifts. This presents, in my opinion, an incredible opportunity for our organizations in Sri Lanka. We have a fantastic geographical advantage, rich human capital. We cater to high-end knowledge services and high-tech manufacturing. Our companies are agile, have proven capabilities and strong resources, and therefore can attract businesses which are looking at supply chain diversification. Sri Lanka also has the added advantage of being a beneficiary of the United States GSP program. We've heard and we've seen in the press over the last few months that there have been many large companies such as Google, Foxconn, Microsoft moving out of China and moving to different parts of Asia. This provides billions of dollars of exports for their countries. The value of trade shifts is estimated to be about $150 billion. The potential for Sri Lanka to attract some of this trade and business is real, ladies and gentlemen. As the chairman of the Export Development Board, my passion is to build exports from Sri Lanka. We have been saddled in Sri Lanka with an outdated export basket. The time has come for us to diversify our export basket. I've been preaching this at many forums. However, the government can only support by creating an enabling environment. It is up to the private sector to lead this shift to change our export basket and build a futuristic export basket for Sri Lanka. We've been living on the past, that's fine, but now we need to plan for the future. Furthermore, Sri Lanka's exports as a percentage of GDP is only 18%, whereas in the region, Vietnam is 121%, Thailand 45%, Malaysia 65%. His Excellency the President of Sri Lanka recently at the Export Development Council of Ministers at the first initial forum, which was held after 28 years, announced that he is also passionate about building exports from Sri Lanka, and we need to increase our exports as a percentage of GDP. Our export growth over the last decade has been disappointing, to say the least. Our export growth has been less than 1% over the last decade. And when I look at Vietnam, it's been over 12%. Ladies and gentlemen, the way I see this is to be very simple. We need capital and we need knowledge. Thereby, we need FDI. That is the only way for us to change our export basket. Therefore, capitalizing on the opportunity that is in front of you today with these global supply chains shifting, I think all our businesses should step up and grab this opportunity, not only in terms of business interest, but also to build incredible joint ventures in the future with many partners, targeting US companies, etc. I believe one outcome of this event is also to support US businesses to showcase Sri Lanka and to build joint ventures, etc. Therefore, once again, I reiterate that this event is timely, and as a government of Sri Lanka and as a head of a state organization, that we are extremely supportive of this, and we look forward to create a strong enabling environment for our businesses to thrive and for us to capitalize on these potential trade shifts that are happening. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you'll enjoy listening to all the key speakers today. And more importantly, I hope you'll take export diversification seriously and you will look at these opportunities positively, and at least within your businesses, look at how you can be agile and look at pivoting to businesses closer to you or even newer businesses by utilizing these trade shifts that are in front of us. I wish everyone all the best and have a great day. Thank you.
Hello and good morning to those of us in Sri Lanka, and good evening to our United States colleague, Stewart. I'll introduce myself. My name is Julie Cooper and I'm the Chief of Party of the USAID funded Partnership for Accelerated Results in Trade, National Expenditure and Revenue activity called Partner. The Partner activity it's a 5-year project spanning across the broad scopes it has 2 scopes, one efficient use of government resources and the second is trade facilitation. An important aspect of the Partner project is that it operates under a demand-driven model, which means that within our broad scope, we have the ability to respond to the needs of our counterparts, including the private sector of the country. Today's event is covered under the second scope, which is Objective 2, which involves trade facilitation improved and includes the trade community supported and private sector informed. The Partner team recognised very early on that there were significant global and regional supply chain shifts underway due to global trade tensions accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic, with significant implications for Sri Lanka's trade and investment agenda and private sector development. As you may be aware, international companies are reassessing their supply chain strategies and increasingly pivoting their business operations activities to namely Southeast Asia to diversify their risks and exposure whilst relocating strategic industries close to home markets. Their country of choice depends on the cost of manufacturing industry, ranging from electronic devices and components to garment and textile. Sound economic fundamentals and stability of the country, reliable infrastructure and sufficient human capital stock, and low geopolitical and supply security risks. Recent announcements from the US, Japan and the EU, India and Taiwan are also influencing these supply shifts through tax breaks, low-cost loans and subsidies. Some Asian markets will stand to benefit from the supply chain shifts as companies look to diversify their sources of supply as they adopt a China Plus strategy. At the same time, location of production, which would move production out of the region to the US or the EU, will have negative effects for Asian countries. In order to explore this in more detail and provide Sri Lankan public and private stakeholders with fact-driven insights and policy implications, Partner embarked on producing an analytical report that focused on global and regional supply chain shifts, drawing from research and interviews with international and national private sector to provide a business-oriented perspective. This report also identifies drivers of change and implications for a country like Sri Lanka, with a view to provide background information for brainstorming amongst the participants of the event to come up with strategies to make use of opportunities from the supply chain shifts. It is the first such study conducted in Sri Lanka on this topic, to my awareness, and we are happy to have with us Stewart Pierce-Gardner from Deloitte Consulting, the author of a report, to present findings today. Stewart works as a strategy and analytical manager with expertise in trade and logistics. He has 12 years of professional experience in international economic development. He has managed various projects for USAID, the United Nations and World Bank Group across Asia and North Africa. I'm really delighted to be supporting AmCham, the premier facilitator of trade, investment and business relations between Sri Lanka and the USA, in disseminating the findings of the report and discuss the implications of the supply shifts on Sri Lanka. I'm also extremely happy that we have the continued support from USAID to make such events such as this possible, and the support of the partner project to contribute to this event. I thank you all for attending the webinar today, and I trust the event will be both informative and useful for your business industry.
Excellent. Thank you, Julie. And thank you all for the introduction and for inviting me to be a part of the trade shifts and the initiatives that have gone on. I'd like to thank USAID, AmCham, and others, especially the audience, for including me today in this report. And I'm excited to share some of the things that we found. I just want to confirm you all can hear me clearly. I am calling in from the West Coast of the US, so just want to make sure the internet's working. Great. I'm going to share the presentation. Excellent. Can you confirm you see that? Great. And then, as mentioned before, the presentation, the paper will be shared as well. As any questions that you have over the course of the presentation, feel free to send to the email included in the agenda. I've included the end of the presentation so you guys can send it as well, and we'll be happy to answer those questions. So as articulated before, the main problem that initiated this study was the shift from short-term effects of COVID-19 and other long-term economic trends that were forcing businesses to think about where their supply chains were based, the risk and resiliency of those supply chains, and how they could react into the future. So in this era of supply chain redrawing, the report was focused on 5 key objectives. The first one is to take a global perspective on ongoing and future shifts, to provide an international business-oriented perspective on these supply chain shifts, and really understand what could a country like Sri Lanka do to take advantage of these shifts and these drivers. As mentioned previously, the idea is to spark brainstorming to think about what strategies could be developed, what new strategies could be deployed to take advantage of these shifts. Something that struck out to me from the earlier introductions was the $100 billion in expected trade shifts, and if even 1% of that could be shifted towards Sri Lanka, what an advantage or boon that would be. So as Julie kindly introduced me, I have worked across a variety of trade, strategy, facilitation, and customs improvement projects across East Asia, South Asia, and North Africa. I've included a few excerpts from my experience in select projects here. We'll be including this slide deck as well if you guys would like to review that after. But again, thank you so much for including me in TRADESHIFTS, and we can jump into the majority of the report. So over the course of this presentation, I think I have 43 minutes left. We'll cover 5 key areas that parallel the report. The first one is really aligning on the methodology used for the report analysis, the scope, as well as the key definitions as used in this report and presentation. Second, we'll go over the ongoing global and regional supply chain strategies, taking a global perspective, looking at industries focused on single supply chains as well as other alternative strategies. Then we'll look over the likely short and medium-term shifts and what's driving these shifts. What are businesses concerned about? What have key informants revealed are things that they're focused on? 4, I'll talk about what this means for a country like Sri Lanka. Considering its position, what are some peer countries doing? What are some of the changes in supply chains and how will that affect Sri Lanka, as well as what are the industries that are shifting within this space? Finally, as mentioned before, we hope that this starts to lead to brainstorming around new strategies or revising of old ones in order to respond to some of these strategies. So jumping into the report, on the methodology and scope, as mentioned before, the key objective here was to provide a realistic and practical international business-oriented perspective, gathering that through key informant interviews across industries, geographies, different perspectives, to be able to provide an understanding of what's kind of the up-to-date thinking in businesses engaged in supply chain revisions. Second, some focus groups with Sri Lankan businesses as well as international businesses to get an understanding and context to the analysis that we received. I want to thank AmCham for coordinating several of those focus groups. To complement the primary resources that were interviewed, we also complemented that with secondary sources. So looking at up-to-date pulse checks on chief executive, financial officer, and procurement officers and their sentiment on supply chain shifts. Second, complementing that with statistics and surveys from across different public sector and private sector entities and journal articles to provide an update understanding of where these supply chains are going and what could be expected for a country like Sri Lanka. A lot of these sources are perspectives and snapshots in time because the ongoing issue with COVID as well as longer term supply chain shifts due to cost and trade implications are still an ongoing issue. So to start, the scope of this report, really just to be clear on what it is and what it's not, it's focused on large multinational firms already engaged in cross-border sourcing, procurement, and manufacture, based off the presumption that for a global supply chain shift, the businesses need to be already engaged in global supply chains. Second, it assumes a deliberative formalized strategy development. For a strategy to be developed, to be shifted, to be changed implies an original one. So again, focus on larger firms. That doesn't mean the analysis here cannot help medium and smaller firms, but the focus is taking again from a global supply chain view. Third, the hope of this report is to provide some clues to how firms and policymakers may alter their supply chains. Although in reality, different sectors, firms, and countries may vary in their responses due to the variety of drivers and factors that factor into a firm's supply chain decisions. To be clear, this report is not a detailed assessment of which sectors, firms, and products will shift. As mentioned before, as part of TRADESHIFTS, this is the first part of many, and we hope that this sparks continued conversations and study in these areas. Second, and finally, it's not a definitive answer to the evolving question of how and when supply chain shifts will occur. I think no one expected COVID to occur. No one expected it to last this long or be so cyclical. So evolution will continue in both short term in response to things like COVID, but also longer term in terms of where supply chains are based, how nations react, and how individual companies and firms respond to those changes. So just as a quick definition check before we jump into the rest of the report, as I'll use it in this report and presentation, a supply chain is encapsulated and understood the logical process from the acquisition of raw materials all the way through to the final customer in support. I've visualized a linear, simplified supply chain model here, some of the key nodes that we expect to see in the businesses that we've talked to. But in reality, a lot of supply chains are more complex than this. They're either snakes or stars, or they move through multiple different countries to take advantage of trade or tax issues or specific resources. But thinking through a supply chain in this presentation, we'll use this as the model to ground some of the work. Second, a supply chain strategy, as used here, is the process of analyzing, evaluating, defining supply chain from network design, manufacturing, logistics, transportation policy, inventory, carrying policy, digital, IT infrastructure. All of these come together to help a business really succeed in their competitive landscape or their operating environment. One way in which businesses go about developing their supply chain strategy or in revising it due to trends or some of the impacts that we'll talk about over the rest of the presentation is a strategic choice cascade. And this cascade really helps businesses narrow down their aspirations and goal, their competitive environment and operating environment, and then what do they bring to the table to win and to establish their competitive advantage within this marketplace. This thinking is also parallel to some of the discussion that we'll continue with of factors for Sri Lanka, because it's an important concept to think about how businesses are adjusting to the trends and the shifts that we'll discuss later in the presentation. You'll also notice in the upper right-hand corner is a text box. Throughout the presentation, I've included quotes from some of the key informants that I thought helped add to the conversation. I won't go through all of them, but this is helpful, I think, to see some view of the opinions on some of the issues that we've talked about, or that we'll talk about today. So going into the second section, ongoing global and regional shifts in supply chains. I think one of the key things to focus on here, what is the global impact of COVID? What are some of the longer term economic factors that have been driving changes and shifts in supply chains? Talk about what are the trends, specifically how are they affecting different industries across the globe? Third, could we really distill the different types of supply chain strategies into archetypes to help understand both what are the existing strategies out there, but also how are those shifting and what does that mean for a country like Sri Lanka? Finally, diving a little bit deeper from a global perspective on what are the drivers and factors that businesses consider while they're going through that strategy development and their supply chain shift. So in this section, I think it's been articulated really well before I spoke that COVID has just had a dramatic impact on global trade. Thankfully, not as deep as 30% as some have suggested, and a recovery in sight. But just the dramatic nature of how it impacted the global trade and economic situation has been dramatic. The impact of it on a regional basis is ongoing as first wave, second wave, third wave continue, and mitigation and public health is able to address it in certain aspects. But realistically, until a vaccine is in place, it's the impact of the short-term constraint will continue. Some of the key factors that were driving this reduction in international trade were weakened demand in affluent countries, disrupted supply chains as logistics or single points of failure when factories shut down and certain parts and supplies were unable to be provided, or even capacity constraints as companies took the safety of their workers seriously, governments focused on lockdowns in a way that enforced social distancing and limited some of the production capabilities within these factories. So with this short-term impact in context in mind, what were some of those longer-term trends we've been seeing? So in a recent survey of 305 supply chain managers, the top 3 areas that they're concerned about that keep them up at night are trade and tariff implications, reducing supply chain costs, and technology adoption. These are probably not surprising, as these have been a point of conversation for a long time for supply chain managers. But we'll focus on these top 3 areas as they still are the driving area for the supply chain shifts across industries. Now, I should mention that below these 3, there are several other areas around labor, skills, access, potential downturns that still affect supply chain managers and how they develop strategy. For the purposes of this report, we focus on the top 3. but these may be different priorities for industry sectors and companies that engage with certain product and input mixtures across these varieties. So first, trade challenges. The US-China trade tension, which has been ongoing for more than 2 years, has led to a dramatic 38% reduction in US imports. The focus on China here is just due to the dramatic impact of both the scale of the trade restrictions as well as the impact it's had on trade diversion. Both tariff restrictions from the US on China and China on the US have led to both trade destruction as trade is reduced between the countries, as well as trade diversion as trade is shifted to other countries that are then exported to their final destination or market. Additional restrictions on intellectual property, technology transfer, among others, have also limited trade or direct trade between the countries. Now, with this decline in exports, a dramatic decline considering the value of Chinese exports to the US, exports have also shifted to the US from other countries. So Vietnam, a dramatic 52% increase on a biannual basis. Other countries as well showing increase in exports to the United States. Some of this is trade diversion as Chinese products and goods are responding and companies are responding to trade tension and moving to other places of production to meet rules of origin or other requirements. But overall, for a longer term trend for businesses, these trade tensions have increased cost for the supply chains and led them to view this uncertainty as part of their strategy development and response. The second major long-term challenge that businesses have been focused on is cost challenges. Increased cost challenges have led to diversification to lower cost countries as that continued economic growth marches on, especially to countries like Vietnam and Indonesia and the ASEAN region. And these countries enjoy preferred access to the Chinese market through existing trade agreements, which allow for more inter-industry trade as certain aspects of the supply chain, products or services, are moved to the right country with a competitive resource horizon. The drivers of these costs in supply chains have been led by a decline in the real wage gap between the Chinese market and major importers of their goods, a 65% decline in the real wage gap between the US and China in the last decade alone. A declining working age population, as well as higher social environmental compliance costs, have also increased the cost of production. The impact of this has been intra-industry trade and increased trade linkages between China and other countries within the region. This chart here shows one example for major textile exporters and apparel exporters. Bangladesh, Cambodia, Sri Lanka, among these, have shown increased reliance and intensity of their trade relationship with China as these labor-intensive industries are shifted to other countries and destinations. So that's one trend we're seeing, higher cost in production leading to shifts to lower cost countries with preferred market access. The third long-term challenge that international businesses are considering and focused on is technology challenges. The rapid acceleration in technological innovation, increased connectivity between businesses as well as within businesses with Internet of Things and cloud technology is gathered together in a concept called Industry 4.0 or the fourth industrial revolution. These shifts in both energy, production horizons, productivity threaten to really exacerbate the digital divide between early champions and more established manufacturing countries and leave behind slow adopters to adapt to the new paradigm of technology. As I mentioned earlier on, the concept of a linear supply chain is the classical model of how a good is brought to market. But now there's thinking with Industry 4.0 of a digital supply network. So something that's much more of a star with hyper connectivity using technology, cloud, dynamic fulfillment, industrial robots to change how production is done in a way that is shifting some businesses to consider onshoring of production to take advantage of lower production costs in certain industries. Some key statistics backing that up: the global industrial robot base is expected to double in the next 5 years, but 75% of all those sales are expected to be in China, Korea, Japan, Germany, and the US. Really, again, potentially increasing the global digital divide as the fourth industrial revolution takes over. This shift will be most likely highly pronounced in high value add industries like technology, hardware and equipment, and semiconductor industries that will also have pressure from national security interests, which we'll talk about later on in the presentation. So these three long-term trends combined with COVID's short-term shock to supply chains has really revealed almost four archetypes of a supply chain strategy. There are different variations on this across countries, but to think about 70 to 80% of the global trade flows covering some aspect of these strategies. They could be understood best by the distance to market. So are they onshore or offshore from their target consumer market? And how complex is this supply chain? Is it consolidated in one country for production, one country for consumption, or is it distributed in consumption and distributed in production? These aspects have different natures and variations, but I'll use these archetypes for the discussion and then define further where the shifts will occur between or within these strategies. So just a little bit more detail on each of these before we talk about shifts. The first one, the consolidated offshore, is really the China factory of the world model. I mean, this is something that's really been typified through the 90s into the early aughts. Benefits of high productivity, mature supply chains, and a well-developed logistics and transportation sector with some established ecosystems in electronics, automobiles that make production cost-effective at scale. The increasing affluence of the Chinese domestic market has also increased business appetite to locate supply chain and consumption markets in China. But potential constraints include geopolitical factors of rising tension of China's national security interests, rising supply chain costs around social, labor, and environmental policies, and then the distance to primary markets, which things like COVID have revealed the fragility of some supply chains. The second strategy, distributed offshore, is really the shift from China to other lower cost countries with higher labor populations within the ASEAN plus India plus Sri Lanka regions. The advantage of this strategy is taking advantage of lower supply chain costs, either from the labor or a resource constraint perspective, and also taking advantage of inter-industry and external market access. Production in the ASEAN region takes advantage of tariff-free access on goods, as well as strong trade agreements with China to enable inter-industry trade to establish itself in lower-cost countries. Potential constraints are logistical complexity, maintaining operations in multiple countries, different aspects of the supply chain can fail and add extra risk when there's exogenous shocks to supply chain, and then the additional operational burden of maintaining such a supply chain. Regulatory uncertainty of multiple countries and both the national, city governments, local government, multinational organizations all add to complexity in managing supply chains of this nature. As well, potential infrastructure gaps will raise the question for some companies on how effective the balance and trade-off between labor and quality infrastructure is. The third strategy that's revealed through discussion with business informants is a distributed onshore strategy. This is more typical with some higher value, high tariff or restricted goods. Think about like agricultural goods in Europe or automobiles in the United States. These models seek to balance cost and market proximity and access. So they're looking at adjacent countries within broader market systems. Here, I put the US and Europe, but there are other type of regional distributed onshore models that exist. And the advantage of these models is lower real wages in the final consumption market, or identifying the lowest real wage within that consumption market, while still enjoying the preferred market access to trade those goods without taxes or tariffs. The constraints to this model, higher labor costs than offshore strategies and more regulatory uncertainty. Finally, one of the archetypes we're seeing, which is something that's been typified as deglobalization and localization, a reversal of more than 60 years of increased globalization, is being driven by access to both technology capital and resource availability, but also a lot of the national security concerns or cultural concerns that are giving rise to more restrictive trade policies. An additional change is domestic market size, which has become an increasingly area of importance for supply chain managers, where they want to locate their business both to customize to the domestic market so they can make sure their products serve that market explicitly. This could be more known through media or social technology companies that want to be able to produce products that are really targeted towards the ultimate consumer. Finally, quality infrastructure and the potential mitigation of Industry 4.0 really allow supply chain managers and businesses to balance the cost of production with the potential efficiencies through increased technology adoption in the digital supply network of the future. So thinking through these 4 archetypes of supply chain strategies. Now, when we talk about shifts both between these strategies, which can occur over time and industry and perspective, but also within these strategies. Some businesses will operate multiple supply chains for various products tailored to different markets. Some will have a single supply chain to be most efficient. Some industries have to be co-located where there's the right ecosystem or the right set of resources that they can take advantage of. So this will vary across industry, company, and firm. But when we talk about shifts in this presentation, it can be a revision of an existing supply chain strategy. So not all over at the same time overnight, or movement to a whole new supply chain strategy, something in the short or longer term. Examples of some of these shifts to provide context for the consolidated offshore, a shift in textile production to China after the expiration of the ATC agreement in 2005 really had a worldwide impact of the consolidation of an industry to take advantage of a certain cost and production profile. There are a few other examples for different product areas, but I'll shift to the next terminology area. The next one on drivers and factors. This is help to think about what do businesses consider as they're going through their supply chain strategy, as they're responding to short-term impacts such as COVID and longer-term impacts from trade, rising costs, and technology changes. So again, these will differ based off industry, sector, and company profiles, but one of the key things that used to be a focus of was the total cost of ownership. So what is the cost, this driver of supply chains? Procurement teams, CEOs were concerned about getting the lowest cost, most effective supply chain out that they could. This was focused on 2 factors, really value and efficiency. There are a lot of different terms for how this could be brought together, but think about the concept of value. How can a firm or a company produce the value, the economic value, using a set of inputs, labor, skills, infrastructure, the time it takes them to get to market, and the inventory they need to carry in order to create a value in a system. This influences where they locate factories. This implicates how they structure their supply chains and also where they can actually produce. The second is efficiency. So how efficiently, once that value is created somewhere, can they extract that value? Can they get that value to market for sale, but then also get that value back into their shareholders or to the company? Things that reduce this over time are inefficiencies such as logistics, challenges, taxes, custom fees, and duty. But something that's come up recently is risk. If you can't get your product to market, if you can't get it there effectively, or your supply chain collapses due to something like COVID, it really shakes the entire paradigm of the total cost of ownership driver. So how do companies respond to that risk? Well, they balance total cost of ownership with resilience. Something that's been a really major focus of supply chain managers recently has been on increasing the resilience of their supply chains, both after things such as the Thai floods, as well as the Fukushima earthquake, among others. They're really incentivized where there is a high concentration of industries or firms that could subject to a single point of failure. Now, a resilient supply chain has to match the risk profile. A realized risk is something where it justifies the resilience in the supply chain, but not every risk can be budgeted for, or that supply chain risk being unprofitable. So anticipated risks such as labor challenges, regulatory uncertainty, currency fluctuations are usually budgeted for and managed by companies. But unanticipated risks like COVID, war, natural disasters are things that maybe black swans, maybe something they focus on more, but tends to be something that follows specific issues in the news and then recedes over time. But that balance between total cost of ownership and resilience is now being considered through the prism of the third driver of domestic market size. Businesses want to be where the markets are. They want to be able to customize their products, get them just in time for manufacturing, but also be able to quickly respond to trends and changes in consumer behavior and demand forecasting. So to be in those markets, have access to those markets are critical for the largest global businesses today. Now, this image shows the different GDP share across different countries and regions, and there are borders between these countries. But you should note that trade agreements, market access, things like the EU and their common market blur some of the borders between these markets. And companies will respond to those preferred market accesses in areas where they can reach the most number of consumers for their investment. So considering the trends that we've seen in the 4 strategy archetypes, from consolidated to distributed to onshore, offshore, and these drivers and factors that are driving the thinking of international businesses. In the next section, I want to talk about what we are expecting to see. So what we've talked to in terms of informants, what we've gathered from the literature on the short and medium term shift. So the response by international businesses across to these challenges, and as they balance these different drivers and factors of their supply chain, are really broken down into 3 areas. A short-term shift focused on increased supply chain resiliency, making sure that they understand the risks and challenges of their supply chains and strengthen them in the short term. The next 2 are around medium-term shifts over the 18-month period or more, localizing supply chains and for strategic industries and diversifying them for non-strategic industries. Now, I should note it's uncertain how quickly and how soon businesses will respond and shift their supply chains, and it will again differ across industries and companies. But these are those longer-term macro trends that we're seeing in response to these economic trends that have been ongoing. Now, we know businesses are already thinking about adapting their supply chain strategies to market dynamics. Before COVID hit, we know that that's a continued conversation for these C-suite executives as they move forward. Now, how quickly that happens will depend on the constraints and accelerators that we'll talk about a little bit later, both policy velocity for how countries change their industrial policies to incentivize or disincentivize supply chain shifts, as well as the inertia of both the sunk costs and just challenge of creating and moving a new supply chain to a new country. So from a short-term perspective, how businesses are responding, international businesses are responding, it's primarily to focus on resiliency. In a recent survey of 900 CFOs from 24 countries, so around the world, the consistent message coming out of there, the top 3 areas they were focused on were developing additional alternate sourcing options, understanding the financial and operational health of their suppliers, and then changing contractual terms in order to increase cash flow flexibility. So what do these mean? These are the highest areas, around 51%, 45%, really strong concerns for these CFOs. Well, developing additional alternate sourcing options, something to discuss before this presentation, was, these businesses are looking for alternate suppliers. They want to know what the capabilities of suppliers in other countries, other regions. They want to know if they can alternate source to them in their supply chain in a seamless and connected way that allows them to respond to issues as they come up. So they want to be able to expedite qualification and really develop short lists to make sure that they have a turnkey way of adapting their supply chain. The second one about understanding financial and operational health, One example that someone I interviewed mentioned was a Canadian firm was sourcing PPE, but their Chinese supplier was unable to provide it due to a shutdown in Wuhan. So they went to a supplier in Mexico. That supplier, who was their backup supplier, was also sourcing from the same Chinese firm. So this firm had to engage in an entire focus on visibility to look through their entire supply chain, but also their supplier's supply chain to identify areas of criticality, challenges, to make sure that truly critical components could be provided and there was resiliency in their supply chain. Third, changing contractual terms. Businesses really, and this is something much more critical 3 months ago before more fiscal and monetary support was provided on a global level, but most of these businesses and CFOs were focused on changing contractual terms to really leverage their cash flow to provide them maximum flexibility. These were areas where overall C-suite executives were trying to provide themselves more flexibility, as well as the ability to react quickly in terms of any change to the supply chain. Now, supply chains where buyers have more power over their suppliers in a less competitive industry or more established sole sourcing or connectivity in their supply chain will be more likely to push these three areas of transparency and resiliency on their suppliers. Now, that was the short-term shift to resiliency. The second shift, or the first of the medium-term shifts, but the second shift overall, is a shift towards localizing strategic supply chains. This has been an ongoing issue responding to some of the economic trends we've seen, but in a recent survey of 3,000 companies in 12 global sectors with a combined market cap of over 22 trillion that Bank of America conducted a survey with, it showed that there was high interest, especially among North American and Asian Pacific firms, excluding China, to move supply chains from China. National security reasons, both for restrictions, non-tariff restrictions on technology and intellectual property, as well as tariffs due to U.S.-China's trade tension, were the most cited reasons. Now, this shift was most pronounced in areas like healthcare equipment, where requirements were not being met by existing suppliers. Technology hardware and equipment like 5G and Huawei that were subject to national security concerns, as well as the semiconductor industry subject to the Made in China 2025 and other U.S. industrial policies. Now, I've highlighted in this graphic on the right some of these key sectors, but I just want to emphasize that these aren't necessarily the supply chains that will move, but these are the market size of the respondents that have indicated that they are considering or have announced supply chain shifts. The actual amount and when it will happen is still a point of discussion, and I think further analysis could help reveal which specific sectors, industries, and companies are considering that move. So we take from this that national security interests have been a driving area for strategic industries to shift their supply chain strategies from a consolidated offshore to an onshore strategy. Now, in addition to this medium-term shift to localize, there's been a strong shift to diversify. And this is where I think opportunities for a country like Sri Lanka are most pronounced. Cost factors will drive labor-intensive supply chains to ASEAN countries and India, while high-value supply chains will likely shift onshore to consumer markets due to increased technology adoption and lower of the production horizon. So that same survey that Bank of America conducted with over $22 trillion in market cap of industries across various regions found that the food and beverage and tobacco, consumer durable, autos and retailing sectors were the most likely to consider moving their supply chains from China, largely due to rising tariffs and rising labor costs in China. So what we would expect to see in this third shift or second medium-term shift is a real focus to diversify non-strategic supply chains, largely based around labor-intensive industries shifting to a regional offshore strategy, taking advantage of Southeast Asia, South Asia, and other areas where they can continue to produce at an effective way. So, as mentioned earlier, there are some accelerators and constraints to these shifts. When we will see them, either in the short term or long term, we've defined medium term in the 12 to 18 month period, or 18 months and longer. There are many discussions going on at the policymaker level in many countries, as well as within firms and their headquarters, thinking about how to respond to some of these longer term trends. Some of the accelerators that could increase supply chain shifts from China to a more distributed offshore in South and Southeast Asia could be the U.S.-led Economic Prosperity Network, a new initiative by the U.S., as well as continued Indo-Pacific strategy on reducing reliance on supply chain strategies in China. Tax incentives and reshoring subsidies that have been announced through a variety of countries to promote onshoring of jobs, especially in critical national security areas such as healthcare equipment, technology, and semiconductors. The Trump administration and the Biden campaign have, announced intentions to strengthen Buy America provisions, higher taxes on foreign earnings, as a way to, promote more domestic manufacturing in certain industries and sectors. A lot of discussion in the U.S. Congress is around developing industrial policies counter to the Made in China 2025 strategy. This strategy is the Chinese industrial strategy to promote manufacturing of high technology products and services in China. So there's a potential for that in existing U.S.-China trade tensions to accelerate some of these shifts. Finally, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, others, as part of fiscal and monetary stimulus programs in response to COVID, have announced onshoring tax incentives and subsidies to help their industries move away from single-point supply chains, but also to promote domestic job creation and economic growth. Now, those are the accelerators. Among others, there are constraints that could limit some of these shifts from China. I've articulated a few when we talked about the consolidated onshore strategy for China, but others could be a potential reduction in the U.S.-China trade tension. The Biden campaign has criticized the Trump administration's handling of some relationships with China, and there's a potential with the Democratic administration that trade tension could be reduced. The other 2 points are around the challenge of moving an installed base for a supply chain to wind down existing production and move it to a new area. The high cost of developing a new factory in a new country, as well as long-term contracts with existing suppliers, could constrain and limit these shifts away from China. Fourth, a dual circulation strategy, which is a new strategy from a Chinese industrial strategy, focused on creating both a domestic technology market as well as the adoption of international technology in two dual circles that complement each other but don't overlap, has the potential of creating non-compatible disconnected networks as Industry 4.0 and digital adoption penetrate different sectors. Finally, capacity constraints. China produces $2 trillion a year in value of exports year over year. Even relocating 13% of that value to Vietnam, as an example, would require Vietnam to double its annual output. That's both an opportunity for a country like Sri Lanka, but it also speaks to that the absorptive capacity for these shifts in supply chains will take time as the infrastructure and labor seeks to address that. So how businesses ultimately choose to reorganize their supply chains and mitigate risk will largely depend on their sector-specific strategies. Do want to emphasize that again, but now we want to talk about what does this mean for a country like Sri Lanka? Well, this short-term focus on resilient supply chains, a country like Sri Lanka should expect a stronger focus on its businesses, either from suppliers or supply chains that it's engaged with, to be able to respond to international businesses looking for additional alternate sourcing options. So Sri Lanka may not have been considered before or may already have a relationship, these businesses, with international businesses. They should be expected to prepare the capabilities to respond, prepare, and plan for the changes coming through resilient supply chains. In the longer term, there are other capabilities that could be developed or continue to be strengthened due to changes in some of the short-term supply chain resiliency. Areas such as flexibility to making sure that risk control and adaptation is incorporated throughout a company's production, increasing visibility as both data and supply chains are much more interested in knowing supplier risk and vulnerability across critical areas, as well as collaboration with companies within both vertically and horizontally, industrial policies to coordinate with other companies within sectors to advance strategic areas. to finally to op model changes where businesses, an example from one interview was the Malaysian government setting up an e-commerce strategy to help their business change their operating model so they could do direct sales to customers for specialty and local food in the Malaysian market. All of these capabilities together, matched with the short-term measures, are part of what could help Sri Lankan businesses and vendors respond to some of these short-term resiliency measures that they could expect from international businesses. Now, a country like Sri Lanka, what could they expect from medium-term shifts to localize and diversify? Well, international businesses will usually go through a series of strategic planning, scenario planning, what ifs, and due diligence as part of their strategic design to revise or to shift to a new supply chain strategy. They'll look over the different drivers and factors, total cost of ownership, resilience, as well as market size as they're making decision-making on their supply chain. So as part of, I'll focus on each shift individually, as part of localizing supply chains for strategic industries, there's a potential to focus on industries that are responding to COVID-19, healthcare equipment, apparel industry shifting towards responding to that increased demand, but within the context that focus away from, or the challenge, understanding the challenge of capital intensive and highly competitive industries. A shift in supply chains and strategic industries in semiconductors, technology, hardware, and equipment may or may not be a great opportunity for Sri Lanka to pursue. However, that doesn't mean that there are not industry services or products aligned with some of these areas. On the diversified supply chains for non-strategic industries, as this shift occurs in the medium term, most likely the expectation is that the consumer durables and apparel, retailing, automobiles and components, food, beverage, and tobacco, among a subset of others, are potential to shift to South and Southeast Asia to seek lower costs. The idea is to look for industries that are most likely to shift, either from having announced it or responding to these longer-term economic factors, and then the products within these industries to think about which ones are most ripe for the production frontier and capabilities of a country like Sri Lanka. Finally, look for businesses that are engaged in contract manufacturing to shift early, as those are most likely to be able to address some of the cost inertia of relocating production. Now, in this context, other countries are also preparing competitively for how to attract these businesses and supply chains to their country. So in that context, wanted to propose some initial set of factors as part of the brainstorming of new strategies or revised strategies. So within this competitive environment, similar to the cascade in how companies make choices, strategic choices to optimize their supply chains, I think that Sri Lanka could stand to benefit from the shifts, both in the short and medium term, if the right policy measures and incentives are adopted. Three-part factors here for consideration as you guys continue to brainstorm. But first is articulating an industry-specific strategy for why Sri Lanka. So understanding what Sri Lanka has, what it can get quickly, and what it cannot do. And then what is Sri Lanka's competitive position vis-a-vis other countries by production value and efficiency? What are the key sectors that it can target in the competitor countries that will also be going after the same company sectors or firms that are responding to these shifts? One quote from an interviewee is that, Indonesia has a large population with a very low wage rate, with a better geographic position than Sri Lanka. However, its customs processes are a nightmare. These are the kind of considerations that businesses are thinking when they're comparing opportunities for supply chain optimization. Second, improve the product. So thinking about Sri Lanka as a company, or thinking about it as a firm, or thinking of it as a product, understanding how customers or investors are really pleased with operating within the Sri Lankan context. What are the concerns of these existing investors, and what can they tell us about future investors, other people that could shift or move supply chains to Sri Lanka? And then how can Sri Lanka's real and perceived value and efficiency be improved? And I say there's an important difference between real and perceived value because sometimes they don't always match in the real world. So addressing both the real increase in value and efficiency, but also making sure that perception matches within the context of international businesses. One quote from someone I interviewed mentioned that Kuala Lumpur had done a great job of improving their customs brokerage, really stealing a lot of business from Singapore right across the water. So there's an opportunity where a product can be improved, a capability, and can really drive some of that market position. Third and finally, a factor to consider is to sell and market Sri Lanka to investors. So think about these companies. Who are these companies in the target industries and sectors? What products are they focused on? Where is it that knowing Sri Lanka's industry-specific strategies and knowing the real and perceived value and efficiency, how you can sell Sri Lanka as a destination and then build the relationships to maintain these supply chains as they're diversified. Another example here from someone I interviewed was, Chennai had worked closely, the city of Chennai in India worked closely with DHL to build a public-private partnership to improve its ports and warehouses, attracting a lot of logistics and distribution groups after the recent IST change in India. So proactive fixing of barriers or bottlenecks really are an opportunity to increase the strategic position of Sri Lanka vis-a-vis other countries as these supply chain shifts are underway. So I want to conclude there. I apologize, I'm a minute over, but I want to thank you again for listening to me today. And please, if you have any questions or follow up on any of the things discussed today, I've included the email here, tradeshift@amcham.lk, and then I'll hand it off to Bri. Thank you all.
Before Bri jumps in, I'd like to thank Stewart for this informative and insightful presentation. I'm sure the participants have found the details illuminating, which provides them with issues to consider. And I'm sure many of you have questions. And as Ray has suggested, could you email your questions to AmCham? We're looking forward to be able to provide you with some answers, and also I hope you now have some information that will help you to deliberate some solutions of progress this important issue of the supply chain shifts. Thanks to everybody for attending. Over to you, Ray.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you, Stuart, for your detailed and yet extremely succinct presentation. I just want to, as Julie said, remind all of our invitees that you can share in any of your questions or clarifications that you may have to tradeshifts@amcham.lk, and of course, Julie, Stuart, and their partners at Partner, yes, of course, the pun intended, will do their best to provide you with the information you require. In the interest of an efficient response system, I think it would be most practical if you could share your questions by or before the close of business, maybe on Friday, which will give Partners some time to do the necessary work to answer your queries in a detailed and effective manner. Now, let me invite AmCham Sri Lanka's Honorary Secretary, Shirendra Lawrence, to make the closing remarks.
Good morning, everybody. I trust you can hear me, right? Thumbs up there, you can hear me? Thank you. So this morning surely has provided plenty of food for thought, I'm sure, as we look to repurposing and reinvigorating our businesses and of course the economy itself. Early in the session this morning, we heard Prabhash Dubasinghe, the chairman of the Export Development Board, express his passion to build exports. And to quote a few points from his message, our percentage of exports is just 18% of GDP. Growth has been disappointing. He feels it's time to diversify our export basket. And for any of you who have spent any amount of time with him over the last year or so, you'll relate to that, because it's a message he's been speaking about for some time. And he suggests that we use this opportunity to step up and grab it, and it is time to pivot. Stuart's charts that he shared with us also showed us that other Asian countries have taken bigger advantage already of the shifts. Vietnam exports have grown over 50% over the last 2 years, whereas our growth has been just 10%. This is to the USA. So there is indeed opportunity, and there is no doubt that Sri Lanka can and indeed must make use of these available opportunities, $150 billion is no small change. As Stewart said, even a small percentage will have a significant impact to us. Sri Lanka has, over the recent years, has had to deal with more than its fair share of challenges to our economy. And yet in the past decade has managed to elevate ourselves to middle income status through the hard work and resilience of our people. I certainly see no reason, despite all the recent setbacks. As our President Prasanta mentioned at the beginning, we are perfectly poised geographically and from a capability and capacity standpoint, and now is the opportunity to step up. And a reminder that Stewart appraised us that the key objective of this initiative is to provide a realistic and practical international business-oriented perspective. And I think from the time that he took taking us through the presentation and the way he did it, it really does get the brain cells ticking over. We at AmCham are indeed grateful to all of our fellow private sector participants on this program, who will be working with the sectoral study groups over the next week, for your time and commitment, invested to identify the specific opportunities for industry and collectively for the country. And of course, to look at the challenges and the threats that may require some policy reform in order to leverage on these opportunities. These will, of course, then naturally cascade to benefits for our individual companies. So there's something in it for everybody. At the same time, we look forward to the commitment of the government to engage with AmCham to seriously address the suggestions and recommendations of the project, and to also work collaboratively with the private sector in securing this, at least a part of this massive trade opportunity. We're very grateful to USAID for collaborating with AmCham and funding this project and believing in our vision and helping us to make it a reality. And of course, to their partner, Deloitte, for their work in this context. Your Excellencies, Honorable Ministers, Members of Parliament, Honorable Secretaries, Chairpersons, and representatives of ministries and government agencies, my fellow associates and colleagues. Thank you to everyone who's taken the time this morning to be here and to listen in on what's going on, and we look forward to your active participation. We do see a truly interesting and fruitful few weeks ahead, leading to the conclusion of this project, where hopefully we will figure out how we can grab with both hands every opportunity to make a better place and a better life for our children and their children to come. Thank you, and with that I'll hand back to Rai for a formal closing of this morning's session. Thank you.
Thank you, Shirendra. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for spending your morning with us at the launch of this exciting initiative. I look forward to working closely with all of you in the sectoral study groups and meeting you all again in a couple of weeks when we gather to share the outcomes. Have a great and blessed day. Stay safe wherever in the world you may be. And of course, Ayubowan.